at 00:15 hours on February 28, 1942. 12. Armstrong Whitworth. Whitley bombers crossed the French coast at 3,000 feet aboard the aircraft. 120 men of C Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Parachute Brigade prepared to jump. They wore blackened faces. They carried Sten guns, grenades, and wire cutters. One man, Flight Sergeant Charles William Harold Cox, carried no weapon. He carried a screwdriver, pliers, and a flashlight. Cox was a radar technician. Royal Air Force, 26 years old, former cinema projectionist from Doncaster. He had never parachuted before tonight. He had never been in combat. He was about to land in occupied France, dismantle a German radar installation component by component, and carry the pieces back to England. The entire operation would take 2 hours. 30 German defenders guarded the radar site. 100 more German troops were billeted nearby. The nearest German reserve battalion could arrive in 1 hour. The operation was called Biting. The target was a Würzburg radar. The mission was to steal Hitler's technology before he could realize what had been taken. This is the story of the first Commando raid, designed not to destroy but to steal. A precision operation combining paratroopers, engineers, radar specialists, and naval forces to capture equipment that would determine the outcome of the electronic war. It demonstrated what signals intelligence, airborne forces, and meticulous planning could accomplish. And it proved that sometimes the most valuable weapon on a battlefield is a screwdriver. The narrative begins not at Bruneval but in England. In the summer of 1941, when Bomber Command began losing aircraft at unsustainable rates, night raids over Germany, which had previously suffered 10 to 15% losses, suddenly jumped to 20%. Entire squadrons were being destroyed. Crews who survived one mission rarely survived 5. Something had changed in German air defenses. Dr. Reginald Victor Jones, 29 years old, head of scientific intelligence at the Air Ministry, suspected radar. British radar had won the Battle of Britain. Chain home stations detected German aircraft at 100 miles. Fighters intercepted them before they reached targets. The Germans understood this. They had developed their own radar. Intelligence reported 2 types: Freya, a long-range early warning system, and Würzburg, a shorter-range but more accurate system. Freya was known. Würzburg was a mystery. No one understood how it worked. No one knew its frequency, its range, its accuracy. British scientists needed to examine a Würzburg to develop countermeasures. Without countermeasures, Bomber Command would be destroyed. On November 22, 1941, a reconnaissance Spitfire photographed the French coast near the village of Bruneval, 12 miles north of Le Havre. Flight Lieutenant Anthony Hill, an interpreter at the Central Interpretation Unit at RAF Medmenham, examined the photographs. On the cliff top, 91 meters from the edge, sat a circular structure approximately 3 meters in diameter. Shadows indicated a dish shape. The structure was surrounded by barbed wire. Buildings nearby housed troops. Hill recognized it immediately. This was a Würzburg radar, and it was positioned where British forces could reach it. The Würzburg radar, designated FU-MG-62, was developed by Telefunken between 1937 and 1940. The system used a 3-meter paraboloid dish antenna mounted on a wheeled trailer. The dish could fold along its horizontal midline for transport. When deployed, the system stood 3.6 meters tall. The paraboloid focused incoming radio waves onto a dipole feed positioned at the focal point. The feed rotated at 25 Hz, creating conical scanning that provided exceptional accuracy. The system operated at 553 to 566 MHz, wavelength, 53 to 54 centimeters, pulse length, 2 microseconds, peak power, 7 to 11 kilowatts, pulse repetition frequency, 3,750 Hz, maximum range, 29 kilometers against bomber-sized targets, accuracy, plus or minus 25 meters in range, 0.2 degrees in azimuth, 0.2 degrees in elevation. This accuracy was devastating. German anti-aircraft batteries linked to Würzburg could engage aircraft in total darkness or through clouds. Searchlights guided by Würzburg illuminated targets precisely. Flak guns directed by Würzburg hit targets at ranges where gunners could not see them. British bombers were being destroyed by a system they could not counter because they did not understand it. Jones presented his findings to the Chiefs of Staff in December 1941. He proposed a raid. Size of Würzburg intact, dismantle it, transport the components to England, allow British scientists to examine every circuit, every component, every design choice, develop jamming, develop countermeasures, save Bomber Command. The proposal reached Admiral Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations. Mountbatten had been appointed by Prime Minister Winston Churchill to develop offensive capabilities, small-scale raids, commando operations, attacks designed to harass Germany and boost British morale. Stealing a radar fit the mission perfectly. On January 8, 1942, Mountbatten approved the operation. He contacted Major General Frederick Browning, commander of 1st Airborne Division. Could paratroopers execute such a raid? Browning was enthusiastic. Airborne forces were new, untested in combat. A successful operation would validate the concept. He assigned the mission to C Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Parachute Brigade. The company commander was Major John Dutton Frost, 29 years old, commissioned from Sandhurst in 1932. He had volunteered for parachute training in June 1941. He was aggressive, meticulous, and skeptical of headquarters planning. He would later command the British forces at Arnhem. But in January 1942, he commanded 120 paratroopers preparing for their first combat operation. Frost studied the intelligence. The Würzburg sat atop cliffs 300 feet high. The cliffs descended steeply to a narrow beach. German defenses included a villa 100 yards from the radar housing technicians and officers. An enclosure 200 yards south contained garrison buildings housing approximately 100 troops. A platoon of infantry defended the beach approaches. Machine gun nests covered the beach. Pillboxes commanded the cliff paths. But the beach defenses had weaknesses. No mines, minimal barbed wire. The beach was patrolled but not constantly occupied. If attackers could reach the beach quickly and establish a perimeter, Royal Navy landing craft could evacuate them before German reserves arrived. Frost divided his force into 5 groups. Each group was named after a Royal Navy admiral. Nelson would secure the beach for evacuation. Jellicoe would assault the radar site. Hardy would assault the villa. Drake would assault the enclosure. Rodney would be the reserve. The technical component posed unique problems. Dismantling a radar required expertise no paratrooper possessed. Frost needed a radar technician, someone who understood the equipment, someone who could identify critical components under fire and darkness, someone willing to jump into occupied France. The Air Ministry provided Flight Sergeant Cox. He was told the mission required him to examine equipment in France. He was not told the equipment would be guarded by Germans. He received 3 days of parachute training. On his second jump, he broke his ankle. He continued training with the ankle taped. On February 26th, he was informed the operation would occur February 27th. He had 48 hours. Cox studied a British radar set. He identified components he believed the Würzburg would contain: the transmitter, the receiver, the pulse generator, the display cathode ray tube, the power supply, the feed horn assembly. Each component weighed 5 to 20 kilograms. Cox would have to dismantle them quickly, identify them correctly, and ensure they were not destroyed during extraction. Lieutenant Dennis Vernon, Royal Engineers, would assist. Vernon commanded a squad of sappers trained in demolitions and technical reconnaissance. They would provide security while Cox worked. They would carry the components. They would demolish what could not be removed to prevent German reconstruction. On the afternoon of February 27th, the assault force assembled at RAF Thruxton. 12 Whitley bombers of 51 Squadron. Squadron leader Charles Pickard commanding. Each bomber would carry 10 paratroopers. The Whitleys were obsolete as bombers but served well as parachute transports. The ventral turret had been removed. Paratroopers exited through the opening. It was uncomfortable, dangerous, and effective. At 22:15 hours, the Whitleys began takeoff. Weather was marginal. Cloud cover at 3,000 feet. Temperature -2 degrees Celsius. Wind 15 knots from northwest. The meteorologists predicted improvement. The forecast was optimistic. The flight path crossed the channel at wave-topped altitude to avoid German radar. As the bombers approached the French coast, they climbed to 3,000 feet for the drop. At 0007 hours, February 28th, the coast appeared. Pickard identified the drop zone, a field 500 meters inland from the radar site. At 0015 hours, the Whitleys reached the drop point. The red light illuminated. Paratroopers stood and hooked static lines. The green light illuminated. Go! Frost jumped first. 119 men followed. The drop was scattered. High winds dispersed the force across 2 kilometers. Men landed in fields, hedgerows, and barbed wire. Some landed within meters of the drop zone. Others landed over a mile away. Frost assembled 30 men immediately. The remainder trickled in over the next 20 minutes. By 0040 hours, Frost had 98 men organized and moving toward their objectives. Nelson Group, under Lieutenant Ewan Charteris, moved toward the beach. Their mission was to secure the evacuation route and establish communication with the landing craft. They encountered minimal resistance. 1 German guard was captured. The beach defenses were lightly manned. By 0050 hours, Nelson controlled the beach and cliffs. Hardy Group, under Lieutenant Peter Young, assaulted the villa. They approached silently. The villa appeared unoccupied. Young kicked in the door. The villa was empty. German officers billeted. They were apparently in the enclosure for the evening. Hardy secured the villa without firing a shot. Jellicoe Group, under Frost himself, assaulted the radar site. This was the critical mission. Cox accompanied Jellicoe. As they approached, they saw the Würzburg, the dish, 3 meters in diameter, sat on its trailer. The paraboloid reflected moonlight. The trailer was positioned near the cliff edge for maximum radar horizon. The equipment cabin attached to the trailer base housed electronics. 2 German guards stood near the radar. Frost's men opened fire. The guards died instantly. More Germans emerged from a nearby hut. A brief firefight erupted. The Germans were suppressed. Frost established a perimeter. Cox moved to the radar. At 0057 hours, Cox began dismantling the Würzburg. He worked by flashlight. German gunfire struck nearby. Frost's paratroopers returned fire. Cox ignored the combat. He removed access panels from the equipment cabin. Inside, he found racks of electronics, tubes, transformers, circuits. He began disconnecting components. The transmitter unit weighed approximately 15 kilograms. Cox unbolted it and handed it to a sapper. The receiver unit weighed 12 kilograms. Cox removed it. The pulse generator was integrated into the transmitter. The display unit, a circular cathode ray tube, was located in a separate operator's cabin. Cox removed it carefully. The tube was fragile. Breaking it would render analysis impossible. The feed horn assembly proved problematic. It was mounted at the focal point of the paraboloid dish. Reaching it required climbing onto the trailer. Cox climbed. He unscrewed the mounting bolts. The assembly was heavier than expected, 20 kilograms. He handed it down to sappers who nearly dropped it. At 0115 hours, Cox had removed the critical components: transmitter, receiver, display, feed assembly, power supply, cables, approximately 80 kilograms of equipment. The sappers placed demolition charges on the remaining structure. The paraboloid dish was too large to transport. It would be photographed and destroyed. At 0120 hours, Vernon detonated the charges. The dish collapsed. The trailer was damaged beyond repair. The radar was destroyed, but the critical components were intact and in British hands. Drake Group had assaulted the enclosure simultaneously. They encountered heavy resistance. The garrison was alert. German troops returned fire. A prolonged firefight developed. Drake could not penetrate the enclosure. Frost decided to withdraw. The mission objective, the radar components, had been secured. There was no reason to accept additional casualties attempting to clear the garrison. By 0130 hours, all groups were withdrawing toward the beach. They carried the radar components. They carried 3 prisoners. They carried their wounded. 1 paratrooper, Private McIntyre, had been killed assaulting the villa. Another, Lieutenant Charteris, was wounded. The force moved down the cliff paths to the beach. The descent was treacherous. The paths were steep and icy. Men carrying equipment struggled. Some slipped and fell. The radar components were nearly dropped multiple times. Cox accompanied the equipment, ensuring nothing was damaged. At 0200 hours, the force reached the beach. Nelson Group had established a defensive perimeter. Landing craft were scheduled to arrive at 0230 hours, but at 0215 hours, no landing craft were visible. Frost fired recognition flares. No response. He fired again. The paratroopers on the beach were exposed. German reinforcements would arrive soon. Without landing craft, the force would be trapped. At 0227 hours, landing craft appeared offshore. 6 LCAs. Landing craft assault from HMS Prince Albert. The craft approached the beach cautiously. Surf was moderate. The coxswains hesitated. Frost waded into the water and signaled frantically. The craft came in. Loading began immediately. The wounded were loaded first. The prisoners, the radar components, carefully wrapped and secured. Then the troops. German reinforcements arrived as loading continued. Approximately 50 German infantry attacked from the east. A firefight erupted. Nelson Group provided covering fire. The landing craft engines roared. Paratroopers waded through surf and climbed aboard. At 02:45 hours, the last landing craft pushed off. German fire intensified. Bullets struck the water. One landing craft was hit but not disabled. The craft withdrew at maximum speed. By 0300 hours, they were clear of German fire. 3 paratroopers had been killed. 7 were wounded. 6 were missing. The missing men had landed far from the drop zone. They attempted to evade but were captured within days. 2 French civilians who assisted the evaders were deported to concentration camps. The human cost was significant but not catastrophic. The landing craft rendezvoused with Prince Albert at 0330 hours. The ship departed at maximum speed. By 0600 hours, February 28th, the force was approaching Portsmouth. At 0900 hours, they docked. The radar components were unloaded and immediately transported to the telecommunications research establishment at Worth-Matravers. British scientists waited. The analysis began within hours. The Würzburg components were photographed, measured, and tested. The transmitter revealed a klystron tube operating at 565 MHz. This was a frequency British scientists had not expected. The receiver used superheterodyne design with exceptional selectivity. The conical scanning system, driven by the rotating Quirrell feed, provided the accuracy that made Würzburg so deadly. But the most important discovery was vulnerability. The system operated on a single frequency. It could be jammed. The conical scanning could be deceived. False signals could be injected. Chaff, clouds of aluminum strips cut to half-wavelength dimensions, would create false targets, overwhelming the operator. Within months, British electronic warfare capabilities transformed. Window, strips of aluminum foil cut to 27 centimeters length, was developed. When dropped from bombers, Window created radar returns indistinguishable from aircraft. Würzburg operators saw hundreds or thousands of targets on their screens. They could not distinguish real aircraft from chaff. Anti-aircraft batteries fired at ghosts. Searchlights illuminated empty sky. Carpet, white noise, jammers tuned to Würzburg frequencies were developed. These transmitters broadcast continuous noise on 560 MHz, saturating receivers. Würzburg operators saw nothing but snow on their displays. The radar was blind. The impact on bomber command losses was immediate. In July 1943, Window was used operationally for the first time during raids on Hamburg. Bomber losses dropped from 15% to 3% overnight. The German radar network was neutralized. Bomber Command could operate at night without the catastrophic losses of 1941. The strategic consequences extended beyond bombing. The knowledge gained from the Würzburg informed Allied planning for D-Day. Aerial reconnaissance identified Würzburg and Freya installations along the Atlantic Wall. On June 5 and 6, 1944, Allied aircraft destroyed or disabled dozens of German radar sites before the invasion. The German radar network was blinded. Allied aircraft and ships approached Normandy undetected. The tactical surprise that enabled D-Day was partly enabled by understanding gained from one captured Würzburg at Bruneval. The raid itself became a propaganda success. British newspapers prominently featured the story for weeks. The public, starved for good news after defeats in 1940 and 1941, celebrated the raiders. Churchill took personal interest. On March 3rd, he assembled the War Cabinet to hear Frost and several officers describe the operation. 19 decorations were awarded. Frost received the Military Cross. Cox received the Military Medal. Vernon received the Military Cross. Pickard received the Distinguished Service Order. The raid validated airborne forces. The 1st Parachute Brigade had proven it could execute complex operations behind enemy lines. Browning received authorization to expand airborne forces. Additional parachute battalions were raised. Glider infantry battalions were formed. The 1st Airborne Division became a permanent formation. These forces would later fight at Sicily, Normandy, Arnhem, and the Rhine crossings. Their existence resulted directly from success at Bruneval. The German response was predictable. Coastal radar installations received reinforced defenses, additional troops, more anti-aircraft guns, concrete shelters for equipment. But these measures consumed resources. German forces defending radar sites were forces not defending other positions. The diversion was strategically valuable. More significantly, the Germans never realized the raid's purpose. They believed the British sought prisoners or general intelligence. They did not suspect the specific radar components had been targeted. They did not realize their most critical technology had been compromised. They continued using Würzburg in its original configuration for months after the raid. This allowed British scientists time to develop countermeasures before the Germans could respond. The technical intelligence gained from Operation Biting extended beyond immediate tactical applications. The Würzburg components were studied for years. British radar development benefited from understanding German design choices. Post-war, captured German scientists and engineers revealed that Telefunken had developed the Quirl conical scanning system in 1937. Britain had not developed equivalent scanning until 1941. The Germans had been ahead. Operation Biting revealed how far ahead and enabled Britain to catch up. The Würzburg itself continued evolving. The Würzburg Riese, giant Würzburg, used a 7-meter dish instead of 3 meters. Range increased to 70 kilometers. Accuracy improved. But the fundamental design remained unchanged. The vulnerabilities identified at Bruneval persisted. Window and carpet remained effective throughout the war. German attempts to counter jamming achieved limited success. The electronic war had turned against Germany. Cox, the cinema projectionist who dismantled the radar under fire, returned to normal duties. He served in the RAF until 1946. He was briefly famous. Newspapers interviewed him. His photograph appeared in magazines. He was modest about his role. He had simply done what was necessary. He survived the war. He returned to civilian life. He died in 1981. His obituary mentioned Bruneval. Few people remembered what the raid accomplished. Frost went on to command the 2nd Battalion at Arnhem in September 1944. His battalion captured the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge and held it for 4 days against overwhelming German forces. Of 650 men, only 150 escaped. Frost was wounded and captured. He survived the war. He retired as Major General. He died in 1993. His obituary mentioned Arnhem prominently. Bruneval was a footnote, but Bruneval mattered more than Arnhem. Arnhem was a heroic failure that accomplished nothing. Bruneval was a successful operation that changed the war. The knowledge gained from one captured radar saved thousands of lives. The countermeasures developed from that knowledge enabled Bomber Command to survive. The electronic warfare techniques pioneered from Bruneval analysis became standard practice. Modern electronic warfare traces its lineage to February 28, 1942, when paratroopers stole Hitler's radar. The Würzburg captured at Bruneval is preserved. Components are displayed at the Imperial War Museum in London. The paraboloid dish fragments were recovered, post-war, and reconstructed. The transmitter and receiver are intact. Visitors can see the equipment that cost 3 British lives to capture. They can understand what Cox dismantled by flashlight while bullets struck around him. At Bruneval, a memorial commemorates the raid. The Memorial de Bruneval was inaugurated in 2012. It stands near the site where the Würzburg once operated. The memorial lists the names of the men who jumped. 3 killed, 6 wounded, 6 captured, all remembered. French civilians who assisted are remembered. The 2 deported to concentration camps are remembered. The villa still exists. The Manoir de la Falaise. It is privately owned. The radar site is overgrown. The beach remains accessible via the same paths the paratroopers descended. The cliffs are unchanged. Standing at the site, the operation's audacity becomes clear. 120 men, 91 meters of cliff, 2 hours, stealing technology under fire. The lessons of Operation Biting remain relevant. Intelligence drives operations. Technical intelligence can determine outcomes. Specialized capabilities, paratroopers and technicians working together, enable missions impossible for conventional forces. Meticulous planning compensates for small numbers. Speed and surprise overcome defensive strength. Simple tools, screwdrivers and pliers, can be as valuable as guns. The raid demonstrated what combined operations could accomplish. 3 services, Army, Navy, and Air Force, working in coordination. Each service contributed essential capabilities: paratroopers for assault, aircraft for insertion, ships for extraction. No single service could have succeeded alone. The integration was seamless. This became the model for future operations. D-Day itself was a combined operation on massive scale. Bruneval proved the concept. The electronic war dimension is often overlooked. World War II was not only fought with guns and bombs, it was fought with radio waves, radar pulses, and jamming signals. The side that controlled the electromagnetic spectrum gained decisive advantage. Bruneval enabled Britain to contest that spectrum. The German radar advantage was neutralized. British radar superiority was established. The consequences cascaded throughout the war. At 00:15 hours on February 28, 1942, Flight Sergeant Cox jumped from a Whitley bomber over occupied France. He landed in darkness. He walked to a German radar. He dismantled it. He carried the pieces to the beach. He loaded them aboard landing craft. He returned to England. He had accomplished something extraordinary without firing a shot. That was the mission. Steal the radar. Understand it. Counter it. Save Bomber Command. Win the electronic war. All of this was accomplished because one cinema projectionist from Doncaster knew which components mattered and had the courage to remove them under fire. 120 paratroopers, 12 aircraft, 6 landing craft, 2 hours, 1 radar, 3 lives, and the course of the war shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but decisively. German radar, once an insurmountable advantage, became a vulnerability. British electronic warfare, once reactive, became proactive. The balance shifted. Operation Biting was the radar heist, the mission to steal Hitler's technology. The raid that demonstrated what precision, planning, and courage could accomplish. It succeeded because men like Frost, Cox, and Vernon understood their roles and executed them perfectly. It mattered because the knowledge gained saved thousands of lives and enabled operations that shortened the war. And it proved that sometimes the most valuable weapon is not a gun but a screwdriver. And the most important mission is not to destroy but to understand. And the greatest victory is not killing the enemy but taking what he relies on and turning it against him. That was Operation Biting.